This is a Rogue Media Network podcast.
Mariette's on the move.
What?
Mariette's on the move.
Again?
Mariette's on the move.
If you are dreaming about moving to a new city to pursue the life of your dreams, this podcast is for you. Moving 18 times in 23 years to 5 of America's top cities, I know it's not easy to make those decisions alone. I help you develop the dream, the plan, and the move, even if we need to get scrappy to get you there. I'll be doing interviews, career and city spotlights, and sharing my crazy moving stories, tips, tricks, and scams to avoid. Traveling to explore your dreams has never been easier. Now let's get moving.
Welcome back to the Selfish Griever podcast. Today's episode is about a topic that I don't have personal experience with, but I do get contacted by listeners asking about whether or not they should move to a different home or a different town following the loss of their child because the memories can be too much or the community can feel too hard to continue to be a part of. It's a very personal choice and it varies from person to person on, how you feel about things. And so when I met today's guest and heard her area of expertise, I thought that she would be great as a resource for anyone listening who is in that boat that they're trying to decide what's the best choice for them moving forward to either stay in their current home, current town, or to try and move and start new somewhere else. So Mariette, if you could please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. My name is Mariette Frey, and I have a podcast called Mariette's on the Move. I am a certified professional organizer. I'm a certified life coach. And my niche is in residential moves. So it's kind of my specialization. I'm kind of a moving coach per se. So I teach people how to move. Some people I work with them 6 months to a year prior to them moving. And I have a framework that I take them through that essentially starts with kind of their dreams, and then we reverse engineer them into their finances and their robustness, which is their mental and physical health, and the ecosystem or community that they're moving from and they're moving to. So definitely a lot of relevance in kind of what we're talking about today, because there are certain areas that I coach around where I think that your robustness and your mental and physical strength is probably the most important part of whether you should embark on a move. So I'm excited to have that conversation today with you.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I didn't end up moving. My son did not pass away in my home. And he didn't pass away even where I live because we were visiting my mom when the accident happened. So it was in another town at another home. But I do have experience just in general in life living in brief periods, a year or two in different communities than where I grew up, and can speak to when there have been times that I've lived somewhere that I did not gel with the community and that I was even blindsided by that. I always think that I'm a pretty easygoing person or outgoing or that I can adapt to most anything. And so it was surprising when I found myself living somewhere that I just felt like I was always a little out of step with everything else going on, the people in the area. So, and I just can't imagine being, in the vulnerable position that I was in when my son first passed, making a decision that I needed to change because I couldn't handle continuing on in the environment, in the home that I was currently in, and then finding myself somewhere that it was even harder to be and to try and find a way. So that's really the person I'm thinking of when, I wanted to ask you to come on here and share, what are some things that somebody who's considering that should be aware of maybe even some things that aren't commonly thought of, but are, big, can become big issues later on after you've moved.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you Google, when should I move after losing a loved one, there's always that year baseline that they give. And I have several thoughts about that, because I think that part of, what happens in that first year, and I know you talk a lot about protecting your energy, and just the energy it took for you from a survival perspective just to get up every day. So I think that's a really tough baseline. I think humans as a species, we need some sort of line marker that says, I'm ahead of the game or behind the game and I need to catch up. And I think it's really important to remember that you really are protecting your energy when you first lose a child. And I think it's just, there's so many different stages of grief that you're going to go through, and emotions and things that, will catch you off guard that you don't even anticipate. And I know you can speak a lot to that. But I think that it's a very unique and personal journey when you're thinking about moving from the environment that you live in, especially if this was the child's home, right? So there's a lot of things that when you move, people don't really think about. And I know we talk a little bit about kind of protecting your energy, but when you're going to move into a home, there is residual energy in that home as well, right? And so I think it's really important to understand how vulnerable your energy is in that moment, because even just looking for a new place to live, even if it's something that, because within the different stages of grief, sometimes you'll be angry, sometimes you'll just want to cut and run, sometimes you want to isolate, right? And looking at that energy, you don't often think about the energy of the space that you would be moving into. We selfishly think about our own energy, right? And that could take on a life of its own. And I think that's really important to understand when you're kind of in that place of should I leave? Because it's a natural human instinct to want to leave. But then when you leave all those memories and you leave that space, that brings on a whole different level of emotional, kind of discernment, so to speak.
Yeah. And even when I think about the energy that it takes to maintain a home, and depending on the setting of where your home is at, if you're in, a neighborhood that you're very closely located to your neighbors, then the energy that, it takes for that kind of relationship, that dynamic. If you're in a home that ends up having a lot of land or area that you need to be responsible for, even if it's not necessarily landscaping, but just, maintenance and awareness of the space. And that sometimes taking on all those new things that you're not already used to, or you're maybe not already familiar with, if it's a new type of experience that you didn't have before, that can take a lot of energy as well, and in ways that you couldn't really anticipate.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that, you're oftentimes when you're moving into a new space, moving stinks, right? In the best circumstances, right? If somebody's getting married or buying their new, a new home for the first time, and there's still all of the work that goes into it. And I think if you're in a position where you don't have the energy just to even interact from a human perspective, right? Like you talk about on the podcast, having, feeling judgments and feeling guilt and feeling all of those things. Even in the best circumstances, there are some elements that you're going to be dealing with. And I think, again, going back to the, personal journey of whether you're ready or not. And there are some tips that I can give for that. But I think it's really understanding that no one has any right to judge or make you feel guilty in that space, because you know you best. However, it is going to evolve, right? So like where you start off in your journey evolves probably 10 times, from where you end up a year later. And again, I don't love that year baseline, but I think from a psychological perspective, the trauma that you've just experienced, that year marker is kind of when you start coming out of that fog and you can really start processing some things. So I think maybe that, because there's no scientific evidence that says like that year is the year that you have to wait, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I know before we got on the call, we were talking about a situation that I'm dealing with within my family, and their first instinct was just to get rid of everything, right? Because they were angry at what happened in that particular death. So he had basically so she was actually going through a period of time when she was already moving, and she was becoming almost I wouldn't say, well, I guess I could say it like an extreme minimalist, right? But, she just wanted to have a lighter life. Some of it she threw away. Some of it, she kept, and she ended up getting a storage unit because I think in her haste, she realized that she's probably going to want some of that, down the road. So she couldn't bear to have it in her home, and so she took it and put it into a storage unit with some of her other things because she was downsizing again, actually. But I think, in my conversations with her, there was a little bit of guilt. She certainly wanted me to express to your listeners that, not making any rash decisions, because if you want to come back to it and it's not there, that will bring on a different level of guilt and emotion. And she hadn't really fully processed at that point when she was kind of making these choices. And so what might not be important today might down the road be a little bit more important. And so before making some of these moves, really kind of taking it. I don't know that I would pack things up right away, obviously, because it's, you want to stay in that energy, and, you are going to ride those waves because it does come and go. But I think that that's, something that she somewhat regretted and then felt embarrassed by it. So.
Yeah. And those are hard emotions to pile on top of, and not that we choose to do that, but then to find yourself having these other, like secondary emotions as a result of like choices you made because of the state you were in and your grief. And I was thinking as you were talking about it that I think too, there can be a misconception of like that changing your scenery or getting rid of those items is gonna help remove some of the pain. That if you don't have to look at those things anymore, if you don't have to walk into the rooms that, they used to hang out in or they used to sleep in, that then it's not going to be always in your face, the pain and the grief. But it really doesn't work that way. I mean, at a certain point on your journey, if it's feeling like you can't escape, but like you said, that's kind of a little further down the line. If you feel like you just can't ever get away from the tragedy, and especially, depending on the situation, I think that also plays a big part of, the scenario of what happened as to whether or not that is like contributing to PTSD symptoms or other types of like reliving the trauma all the time. But I was like the reverse in that I didn't want to get rid of anything after my son passed. And I even had like I kept all the clothes, even though they weren't any clothes that like his twin brother fit in anymore. And I had like bags of them. I had all the baby stuff that they had like even outgrown. We just hadn't quite been at the point that we were ready to donate them or that I'd had the time to go through them. And I was suddenly keeping everything. And I left their room with the cribs set up for at least a year, even though like his brother wasn't sleeping, in a crib anymore. And it just made it feel like I was able to hold on to him tighter. And it wasn't until I like got to a point in my processing that I realized, which again, like I said, was way down the line, at least a year and a half, that I realized all of those things were not like what keeps him with me. That I, had him with me because of other like work that I had done on myself personally, but it wasn't because that bag of clothes was like in the back closet, waiting there for me.
Boom. Play it.
Have you ever listened to a commercial on the radio or a podcast and thought, I could totally do that? Well, I am challenging you today. Being a voiceover artist is an amazing side hustle that can be done from the comforts of your own home. Heck, it can be an amazing career. Just ask Jesse Carroll. Jesse's got over 1,000 voiceover credits to his name. Ever watch Backroad Truckers? He's the narrator. He's also done a ton of commercials for brands you would definitely recognize. If you're ready to try your hand at voiceovers, go to mariette'sonthemove.com and head to my favorites page to learn more about his new digital course and coaching package. If you use code MOTM, you'll get 20% off at checkout.
Micah Burgess here. I just wanted to drop in for a second and let you guys know that we are rebranding my podcast. We've got a new name, My Doula Micah, my birth, my baby, my life. And we are super excited about extending the content that we've got going from childbirth to postpartum. Now we're including family and marriage and just kind of your life in these childbearing years and what that looks like, and maybe give some helpful tips and wisdom. I mean, I'm 51. I got 6 kids. I think I can help you guys with some stuff. There will still be local interviews, of course. And I'm also expanding now to have including more nationwide interviews. We even have somebody from Canada and Australia. So I'm super excited about this process and what we've got in store for y'all. So join us.
And there were other things people recommend that can become like mementos, like they turn the clothes into stuffed teddy bears or they make them into quilts. And somebody did have like one of those bears made for me, but I don't know, the thought of having his clothes made into a quilt, like I just kept thinking about that if I use that quilt all the time, that like that type of clothing isn't really meant to be a quilt, that it was going to wear out. And like, could I handle, watching it fray and fall apart, eventually over time. So I never like took that step to try and convert any of his clothes into a quilt or anything. But I also have other things like I'm always paranoid about somebody washing the walls at my house, like just accidentally. I don't even have anybody who's over at my house cleaning, but it's like something I worry about because there are pencil marks, scribbles of pencil marks on the wall that Orion made. And I think things like that sometimes like help you remember he was real.
Yeah, and you kept those things because they were a comfort, right? And I think that that's normal. And I think that's a great way to comfort yourself. And I think that it works, right? I think a lot of people go into these situations and they numb in different ways, right? Some people, do it with alcohol. Some people, go to the extremes with exercise. Some people move, right? And they take that distraction of packing up all of their things. And the problem is depending on how you grieve, when you move, you haven't processed any of that. Like I know you found a great therapist and you were able to work through her and she had experience in this area. So, she was able to relate. But I think that, first and foremost, whatever you're doing to comfort yourself, don't make any judgments about that because it's working, right? When you get to a point where you're ready to release and it's becoming less and less and less intense every day, I think then that's when you would be able to kind of make some of those decisions. But I think when you do that prior, it really puts yourself into a place where, like you mentioned, like you don't even know what you're feeling in that moment. Your memory lapses are very real because that's a real part of grief. And so, I think taking the time to not use it as a distraction, really work through some of those feelings when you're ready, because you're not going to be ready right away, right? But I think, to use you as an example, Whitney, you talk a lot about how, when you went through this with Orion, you isolated, right? Like you did what you needed to do to survive at that time. And I think a lot of people go into this situation and they use it as a distraction because now all of a sudden they have a mission and a purpose, and that's what feels comfortable, right? So they go in and they pack everything up and then they move. And in that move, I think, is the hope for a fresh start. But if you are a griever that isolates, when you get to that new place, you might isolate again, right? And so your fresh start isn't a fresh start if you go just to another home and isolate, right? So I think really taking some time to figure out how you're feeling with working with a therapist and a grief group, I think how you're processing it is just as important as when you've decided to move or if you decide to stay for another year. Because what you don't want to happen is get into that next new place and start feeling that judgment against yourself. Like when I got here, I thought I was going to take walks because it's a new environment and I was going to go out and finally be ready to meet friends. And when it comes down to it, you haven't processed anything. So all of a sudden the grief that, of like not being in that space or not, having that energy around you is all of a sudden reality, and now you're judging. And you might be feeling like, oh my gosh, what did I do? And now I want to go home and I can't go home. Right? So those are really things that you should think about. But a couple tips, one, I know you love meditation just as much as I do. And I started meditating. I have ADHD really bad. So I have a really hard time just like sitting in silence with music. Like to me, my brain goes all over. So I started doing guided visualizations, and I had ruptured a couple discs in my back in April, and I started on this like guided visualization. My brother is basically a shaman. He was like, I really feel like this is a really strong tool in your toolbox that you can use to heal. And then fast forward several months, within a week, I lost my relationship, and 4 days later, I lost my dog, who I was super, super bonded with. And so I took my healing meditation and I added a grief meditation because those were two very, very significant relationships that I just built my home. It'll be 2 years, December 29th, that I moved in. And so those are two things that I had in this home, that I have these memories. But when it came down to it, one of the things that right before I had that loss, I was actually working with a real estate agent to list my home. So I was going to be moving back to Chicago. Now I know I didn't talk about it in my intro, but I've moved 18 times in the last 23 years to 5 of America's top cities. So moving to me is just something I do, right? Like every 2 or 3 years, people know that I'm just going to move somewhere else. And I was out there, my cousin's 3-month-old passed away. And I went to Chicago for 2 weeks. She passed of SIDS. So we didn't, we had no answers. And so we were processing that. I come back, I have a week of, compounded grief on that. And I looked kind of inward and I was like, you know what, in my own framework, I talk about robustness and like your mental and physical strength. And right now I'm just not strong enough to process what I've been going through just even in the last 3 weeks, plus, picking up and moving and trying to find a new place. And I physically wasn't in a place to even want to pack things and move it from the inside of my house to the garage and things like that. So what I started doing, when I was doing the meditation, because my meditation is very similar to yours, where, you meet that person, in a place where that's how you want to remember them, and you create this space. I started asking, like, is it okay to move? And when I was meditating and like having this visualization, I would have 1 or 2 tears. And every single time I asked that question in the end, I would just start bawling. And I just knew that meant, if you're looking at your spidey senses and your energy and really like reading where you're at, I was like, I'm not ready. But over time, that was back in July. And now I'm getting to a point where like I still do the meditation every day, and I don't cry as hard. I might shed 1 or 2 things, but I'm warming up to the idea of that, okay, well, maybe in a couple months I might be ready to like revisit this.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's finding something that you can rest your laurels on and say, okay, you know what? This is how I'm feeling. I'm going to listen to that, that like inner voice and that intuition that you talk about on the podcast, because I think it's really important, right? Like our body heals, and everybody's body heals differently on different timelines. And it might be even, in your situation, you were married. Mm-hmm. You could heal faster and come to terms with things before your spouse. And then what do? Right? So there's a couple of things that I tell people when they're really kind of wrestling with this idea to move. And one of the things is to grab 5 or 6 boxes, right? They could be Amazon boxes. You could go to Home Depot and bring them in the house and see how you feel, right? Let them sit for a day or 2. And if you're like, you know what, I just can't bring myself to do it just yet, or you find yourself giving those boxes the evil eye every time you walk past them, maybe it's not time, right? Maybe put them in the garage or put them somewhere where you don't see them. And then maybe in 2 weeks or a month, pull them back out and see how you feel. If you get to a point where you start packing them, I would say start with something easy like a pantry or, a kitchen. Like I don't bake, but I have a ton of baking sheets. I don't know why. I think one day I'm going to. But, packing things like that where it's something that really doesn't hold a whole lot of significance. You could donate, you could get rid of, but having those 5 boxes will give you a really good indication of whether or not you're ready to pack up the rest of the house. And if you get to the point where you pack up those 5 boxes and you're like, okay, you know what, that wasn't quite as hard as I thought, maybe get another 5 boxes. But I think this, unless there's a situation where you have to move, I think giving yourself a little grace is probably the best tool that you can have in your toolkit when you're going through this.
Yeah, and I was thinking as you were talking too about, this house that I live in now, we coincidentally moved into it like 3 months before Orion passed. We moved so that we could be in a better school district for the boys, because at that point Orion had already been diagnosed with autism, and Maverick we knew was more than likely to get diagnosed as well. So we needed to move where we were closer to services for Orion that he was already getting, and to be, set up in the best school district. And I remember after he passed, which was obviously like not on our radar at all as something, as a potential, future possibility, I remember spending like a lot of time sitting in this specific room of my house where the view is like of the mountain that's near my house, and the new neighborhood that we live in has more space, so it doesn't feel like my old house. Like, you saw walls, your whole yard is walls, and you like see the roof line of your neighbors, and sometimes at certain parts of the day you like see your neighbors through the windows. Like we were in a very close like master planned community. And this house has more space in that regard, that like it's got a lot of natural vegetation. So it's really easy for me to sit and feel as though there is nobody else around. I don't like see my neighbors. And there's a ton of wildlife because of, the natural vegetation. And I remember thinking, not immediately, probably at least 6 months, if not closer to a year, like realizing how therapeutic that had been for me to be in this setting that I didn't used to have. And because it could have been easy to like wish that I was still living in the house that we brought my sons home from the hospital to, and that I had like, 2 years in with them instead of just 3 months. Like there weren't a ton of memories solidified in this house. And, but instead I just recognized that like, I felt like that was like for me instead of against me, that was helpful because I had some memories in the house, but it wasn't like unbearable. It wasn't constant everywhere, and that there were benefits to like the setting that this house is in. So I think when you're talking about having your robustness, I think some of that is not just how hard would it be to put yourself in a new setting, but also kind of like how much are you trading away? Like what are the assets or the positives? Positives may be a hard word to like wrap your mind around if you're at that point, but what things are like working for you in the setting that you're at right now? And is there a way to like embrace that instead of it can be easy to focus on the pain because the pain can be so loud and crowd out everything else. And I think that can even be true in your community. If maybe where you're living puts you close to somebody who just always like says the wrong thing, or always seems to be judging you or, making things harder for you, like emotionally, that it can be easy to overlook that you have, meanwhile, like 5 other quieter supporters or people who are constant, but they're like just kind of giving you space and letting you like indicate to them when they need help, as opposed to like the person who's, always showing up like, well, are you better yet? Yeah. Are you done being sad now? Can you go back to, yes. Yeah. And so even, because I think community can be a big part too. I mean, judgment, you mentioned, about talking about judgment, shame, guilt, feeling like, especially if you're in a smaller community where like everybody knows your story, and feeling like anytime you leave your house, you see somebody who like looks at you and you are telling yourself that they're judging you. I felt that really loudly after my son passed, that I just felt so much shame that it didn't matter what anyone was actually saying to me, what I was telling myself in my head, even, subconsciously. So it took me a while to recognize, was this story of shame, even if other people weren't, voicing that. So I think that can be a hard part as well.
Yeah, and everybody wants you to have that, that moment and that fresh start. But, there's judgment if you leave, and there's judgment sometimes if you stay. It's just where you are in your personal journey. It's no one else's journey, right? And sometimes we look at it, and if you can create that safe space, and it sounds like that room that you can see the mountains is like a place where you feel content and you can feel like you're connected. There's a part of the practice in home design called holistic home design, where they help you create kind of that Zen space, but you don't need a designer to have you bring a place. I mean, it could be a couple chairs and like a meditation candle, and a place where you just feel like, okay, I'm going to bring, 2 t-shirts, a teddy bear, and a binky. And I'm going to like create a space for myself, even if it's just in a corner somewhere. I think that that's just as important. But if you do feel like you want to move and you want to get a fresh start, one of the things that I talk about is doing a city POC, or a proof of concept. And within a city POC, it's you going to the place that you want to move to. And sometimes it could be, within your city, but on the other side of the city, or it could be to 5 states away. And you spend longer than a week there. And I know that sounds like a lot, and it sounds expensive, and, with hotels and Airbnbs and all that stuff being what it is. But what that does is that it lets you experience moving without any of the risk. right? So you're not giving up a lease. You're not giving up, selling and spending all the money to find a new place and all of that stuff. But it allows you to go and get away from the environment that you're in and take some time and really live that life. Go to the grocery store, go to the library, go to, put yourself in that position as if you have moved there. But meanwhile, you haven't had to pack anything. You haven't made any of those big decisions that could have big implications or repercussions if you decide that you regret it. And by going to do a city POC with the people that I coach, believe it or not, half of the people don't end up moving. And that's what you want, right? You want to feel that, okay, I'm content in staying here for 1 more year or 2 more years, and then I'll make that decision. But I feel like a lot of times when somebody has moved, you no longer have that benefit of making that decision. And sometimes people even will rent out their house for a year or 2, just to get away, but you can still go back. And I think giving yourself those options when you're in that place where decisions aren't coming easy, sometimes those decisions are the best decisions not to make, right? It's just to hold in your space for a little bit until it's more clear. Because I know many people that, they make a decision that they're going to move and then nothing seems easy. There's roadblocks and judgments and shame and all of these things. My brother moved from Sedona to Phoenix to be close to his best friend. And it was terrible. His car got broken into and he couldn't find a place. And it was just hard after hard after hard after hard. And then he gets into that space and he finally finds a place. And 2 months later, his best friend's wife's mom ended up needing a liver transplant, and they moved to Chicago. And then he had nobody in his community, right? And he had moved for them. And I think the thing is as an adult, just in the best circumstances, it's hard to make friends when you're an adult, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so think about moving into another community, and that's why ecosystem is part of that, because or part of the framework is because you take where you're moving from, and you have to take some of those things that are the pros, not the cons, obviously, into that new space. And if one of the reasons that you want to move is to be closer to family, to feel supported and feel loved in a time when you don't have that support, then 100%, right? But take that into consideration, because, the community that you moved into where you thought you were going to love it and you were like, oh, it's not as great as I thought, that's a hard reality when you're emotionally in turmoil,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's a hard decision to go back on. I think it's doable. And I think, going into a space, even if you decide that you want to start shopping around, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I think going to a real estate agent and saying, listen, I just went through a traumatic experience a year or 2 ago. I think I'm ready to look, but I'm not sure. Can we go and maybe look at 5 properties? And go back and see what that feels like, right? Come home and journal, talk to a therapist, talk to a friend, and don't ignore any of those signs, right? So, you talk about intuition on the show as well. And those come up for a reason. If for some reason something keeps coming up, lean into it. Figure out why, right? Because you have nothing but time. When you're not in a position where you have to leave, take a moment, because it might not reveal itself right in that moment, but it might down the road. And a little trick that I give to people too, we talked earlier in the show about how, there's energy in used homes. So, obviously even when you build, but the energy going into a used home can really dictate your experience. And based on your energy and how vulnerable you are in that place, if you spend a little time becoming stronger, whatever residual energy is there can be, obviously taken away with different things like saging and, pouring white light into it. And there's all kinds of different tricks that you can do. But one of the things that I often tell people, whether they're spiritual or not, is when you come into a property, taking a moment and asking permission to be there. Like, I didn't ask for permission when I came onto my property. I just bought it and I moved in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in hindsight, I think that if I would have taken a little time and asked, my spirit guides and asked the energy, because I inherently knew something wasn't right. But I knew that I was also getting outbid by a lot of different people. And it's just me. I don't have a family or a trust fund or something that, like I can go and bid $100,000 over everybody else. I was presented with an opportunity and I just jumped at it because it was kind of spontaneous, but I knew I wanted to buy a house. So I ended up building this home. And I think having asked permission to occupy this particular space, I think would have put me in a different role or a different position, maybe. But also asking when it's time to leave. I think that that's another thing that's really important too. Not necessarily like in just in meditation, but just in general. Like, is it right for me to leave right now? Am I in a good place? How am I feeling? That could produce tears. That could produce anger. That could produce something. Listen to it. Right? Mm-hmm. Lean into that. And then maybe journal or talk to a therapist again about kind of what's coming up and get a different perspective. It's hard when you're in that space and just talking to somebody that is, in it with you, but getting an outside perspective, you might get judgments, right? I mean, you talked to about, at the podcast movement when you told them about your title of your, podcast and they said they didn't like it, but you took that as validation. Sometimes even having a different perspective and something that they say will trigger like, oh, that's why I was supposed to lean in on that. Okay, now that makes sense. Okay, but I'm okay with that. And then you can move forward. But I think when things don't feel easy and you have a gut feeling, if you don't listen to that, it's going to come back in some form or fashion, whether you like it or not, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, where you'll realize like, well, there's a reason I was feeling that way all along. And I think you can even take it as, in my opinion, what I would do is I would even ask for a sign, either a sign that I should move or when you're looking for a place, I think, as you were talking, I was thinking about the importance of not being so desperate to get away that you are just in this rush that you will take whatever is, the first thing that comes up on your radar that kind of matches what you're looking for. And making sure that like it's really what's meant for you. And, asking for a sign if this is the house or if this is the town or the area, send me a sign and pick what that is. And then like watch for it and see, what happens. And I think when you're talking about proof of concept, I think that's such a great idea. It made me think about my sister lives in Denver and she loves it. And I've visited her, multiple times over the years. And every time I go, I think I hate driving in Denver. and it sounds silly and like it's something, but like it is something about Denver. And every time I'm like, I don't understand like why exactly, what is it about, but there is just something about that place. I don't know if it's that they have so many transplants. I don't know that if it's like poor city planning, but it just like drives me nuts to drive. I always seem to come across people that I'm like, this is so bizarre and I don't know why you're driving like this. And I just can't handle it. So I always think to myself, like, there is no way my sister would love if like our whole family transplanted to Denver someday from everywhere, right? Because she loves it so much and she never wants to leave. And every time I go, I just think like, I don't mind visiting, but I could not live here. And so I feel similarly about Phoenix. Like Phoenix is just, it's too much for me. I don't want to live there when I go visit, but I've been to other places where I've just thought, when I visited for a short period of time, like, oh man, I just love the energy here. I love the way the people are. But I think, to your point about making sure you stay for more than a week, and especially if you're considering going somewhere because you have family there, I think that would be really important to stay for an extended period of time, because I think it's easy to romanticize what it will be like based off of what, a 4-day vacation there was like, or and
everything's
thinking
magical over a weekend.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And thinking that everybody is still going to keep showing up and supporting in that way. And then maybe realizing it, being like this rude awakening of, well, like actually they have to go back to their lives. They have other responsibilities. They're not, gonna be available to that extent that you were expecting or romanticizing, was gonna be. So that definitely would be.
I think that like having that conversation about those expectations is really important as well, right? So, it's one thing when you go and visit a place. Like I find oftentimes when I go and visit, I have to go to those people. I have to go and make the effort. And, I would hope that in my times of need, they would come to me, but that's not always true, right? And so, having that conversation, staying somewhere for 2 or 3 weeks, and, hopefully if you can, like if you can work remote or whatever, but having those baseline conversations and saying, listen, like if I move here, it is because I want to spend more time with you. Are you capable of that? What does that look like? And, can we have, brunch or a walk every Saturday morning? Like, is that because what ends up happening is you put that pressure on someone else and then they feel the pressure that, you just had unmet expectations and now all of a sudden you're the bad guy, right? Mm-hmm. I'm a very outgoing introvert, if that makes sense. Like I love my alone time in my full-time job because this is kind of what I do on the side. In my full-time job, I'm a sales manager and I travel all over the country and I'm with a ton of people. And I find when I get back from travels, like I retreat. I need a couple days to fill my tank by myself and just get some cuddle time with my pup. And, and then I can fill my tank up and then get back out there and expel that energy. But when you're moving into a new space or you're moving to a place where you have old relationships, even just somewhat talking through what that looks like, because that person could have changed or doesn't, is going through something themselves where they can't support you. And now all of a sudden you're like, but I moved here for you. And they could be like, I didn't ask you to,
mm-hmm.
And that's an even bigger, harder relationship boundary to like kind of overcome, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I think that, part of why I talk about the ecosystem and community is like you look at the blue zones across the world and they all point to community as what kept them alive for over 100 years. And so I think carefully choosing that community and the people that you surround yourself with, like, I know we talked about like people say dumb things because they don't know what to say. But then there's some people that will just go and sit with you in silence and be there for you. And like that fills you up, right? Mm-hmm. Like when you're making your pro and con list, and I have a workbook that like, if you join my mailer, you get the workbook. It has in there, it's like 14 pages, but it has everything in there from like, who are the 10 people in your network that you are going to surround yourself with or that can help you move and thrive in that community. Like write those people down and then have those conversations. And like, depending on where you are now, I have kind of a values list. Like, do you love getting up in the morning and, walking your dog to a coffee shop and having that quiet time and that, reflection time? Or do you want to be in a big city where, you can't hear yourself think and, it just distracts you? Like really spend some time, because in that next chapter, everything's going to feel different. It's just what brings you joy and what brings you peace versus what's a distraction from you actually processing your feelings.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. And I was thinking about, I could see in people that I know that like, if I just simply sat down and had the talk with them of like, hey, I'm going to move here and this is what I'm looking for, that even they themselves would have a propensity to romanticize like, oh yeah, we're going to get together every weekend and we're always, we'll have dinner once a week and that it's going to be great. And I could see that like, I would need to spend some time there to see like, does it really end up working out that way? And not through any fault, of that person. It's not like they're lying to you, but I think it's not a one-way street like they're romanticizing. And sometimes even people are, excited to be that person for you that you want, you want that, but that they almost like forget, like they get a blind spot about like, well, actually, 4 nights a week I have other obligations.
Yeah.
So that means like one night that's left to myself, I'd be giving up to, or
Yeah.
it only works if you're available on every Thursday of the week. And, or, well, actually I end up traveling, 2 weekends out of the month every year. So, if weekends are the only time we can get together, then it's really only going to be occasionally. And so, going back to those feelings and the intuition and being really discerning about what are you experiencing, and not just what are people telling you, or what are you researching and reading, about an area, but like what did you feel when you actually went there?
Yeah.
And so taking that extra step.
Community is important. And, even like crossing state lines, even if I were to move to South Carolina, like my therapist, who I adore, he has gotten me through some of the toughest. 2023 was the toughest year I've ever had in my life. And I would have to give him up, so I'm like, am I ready to give him up right now and find another therapist and go through the interview process? Because I think that's important too, is like, if you, you meet a therapist and you don't connect, they expect that they're not going to book every single, client into their roster. They expect some, and the good ones are going to interview you back, right? And say like, what, I don't know if I can help you here. So, I think that that's important too, but like finding in that ecosystem, the right schools and the, your therapist and your specialist doctors. And because sometimes we don't think about that stuff. Like I moved down to Central Illinois, and I'm in remission for an autoimmune. But at the time, like I didn't even think, like I just assumed they had that kind of doctor, holistic functional medicine doctor that specializes in gastroenterology. No, they didn't. So I was traveling back up to Chicago, but like even taking it one step further, like if you decide to do a city POC, do some homework and figure out where within that city would be a good place to look, right? If we talked about the coffee shop and taking walks, or if you need to have a certain, type of support from a, education perspective, like even jumping on Facebook groups. There's a ton of Facebook groups for anything you can imagine. I know that you know that, but moving to Florida, moving to Kansas, whatever that niche is that you feel like nobody's going to understand, losing a child, or like your community, finding somebody to connect with prior to moving. If you go and do a city POC and you're like, what, I spent 2 weeks here, I actually really felt good energy, I think this is something I want to do. You don't have to buy a place. You can rent your house out and rent a place there. There's so many options, and people really get tunnel vision on what to do sometimes. I have a Facebook group. I'm happy to answer questions and, throw some things out there. And the people in the group also sometimes throw their perspectives out there. Take in all of the suggestions and find what works for you. It's a personal journey, and moving is a very tough, stressful, but can also be magical. If you build a solid foundation and that mentally and physically you're strong enough to take on whatever comes your way, we're here to support you. But I think that taking that time to really figure out what it is that you're in your heart of hearts experiencing right now, that I think is a great first step.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all great advice, and so many things to think about, and actionable steps, that somebody could take who's really interested in considering it and trying to take it further. I'm curious if you have any advice for, couples who maybe are split on whether or not, one thinks they want to move and the other thinks that they don't.
Yeah, it comes up a lot, as you can imagine. I would say taking some time to figure out where the differences are, right? So, if you are in couples therapy, this is a great place to start, right? And like making a list, like, here's the reason I want to stay, here's the reason I want to leave. And then on the other side, doing that as well. And kind of talking through some of that, because I think sometimes perspectives, especially when you know that person so well, the different perspectives can help heal, because they do know kind of where that yin and yang is for that couple. And I would say, if one person's a little further ahead than the other, just wait, right? Do an extended POC, or, spend some time talking through and maybe just pack 5 boxes and see how you feel. That person might say like, oh, you know what? That wasn't as bad as I thought. Maybe I am a little further along than I thought. And if it's when you're at that point when it's like a complete stalemate, that person just needs time to heal just a little bit longer. And sometimes, healing can happen in a day, in a week, in a month. So not having a timeline and extending a little bit of grace to say like, okay, well, how about we look at this again in another 30 days, and giving them a timeline to start processing, because it could be that they're just not willing to process yet. And you can't do that on somebody else's timeline. That's something that you have to do on your own timeline. And I actually know couples that one has moved and the other hasn't yet. And if you're in a financial position to be able to do that, there was a lot of FaceTiming. I have a particular couple in mind that I'm thinking about, but the one was ready a lot sooner than the other. And they were okay with that. And they were in a financial position where they could live separately. They made it a point to come together every other weekend and spend that weekend together, so they can kind of process together and like where they were, and, still have dates and still nurture their marriage. But they were both in such different places, but it wasn't a matter of like wanting to get divorced. It was a matter of like one wasn't ready to leave and one couldn't wait to get out. And it was 2 total different healing processes and everything. So I think that that's something where every situation is unique, and there are a lot of options. There's not all or nothing. And I think we as human beings, like, a lot of people are very black and white. Do what works for you, right? If it's a matter of, coming back and spending the weekend together in different places and having different experiences, it might give you something else to talk about, outside of just having the grief in common. New experiences, new travel, meeting in a different like place and actually vacationing and actually letting yourself not have the distraction of life. That might be something to do as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Those are all great points. And thank you for answering, because I think that is a hard place to be in, and that then people start to feel like they don't know what to do, or there's no way to resolve it, and that it adds more stress, frankly, to like an already difficult situation.
Marriage is hard without the loss of a child.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Just the day-to-day working on your relationship. It is so hard without that. And you compound that grief and that, just that complication. I think that it's just being, a little bit sensitive and patient. And I think, if it's something that you were already in a position where you guys were already headed down the divorce route, maybe this is a way to kind of come together at a therapist's office and say like, okay, maybe it wasn't what we were supposed to do. Maybe this brings us together. Mm-hmm. So being thoughtful of that other person and where they are is, I think, helpful as well.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Well, Mariette, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing everything that you know. And those were some great tips that I wouldn't have thought of, and I think sound really helpful. So I appreciate it so much. And if somebody wants to find you or learn more about your services, where's the best place for them to connect with you?
Yeah, you can go to my website. It's just mariette'sonthemove.com. I've got all my social media on there. I'm at Mariette's on the Move everywhere, almost all social medias except for LinkedIn, where I'm just Mariette Frey. So thank you so much for having me. I think this is such an important conversation. If any of your listeners have any questions or want to DM me, by all means, I am here to support. I don't charge people. I'm just here to support and help you on your journey.
Thank you so much. I will make sure and link your website in the show notes and everywhere that this will get posted so people can see or can reach you, easily. And I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Well, I could go on forever and ever about moving you closer to your dreams, but I probably should save some thoughts for the next episode. A big thanks goes out to you for making time for me today. And making time for me, you're making time for future you, and we're both grateful. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe to the podcast, download the episodes, and leave me a 5-star review. I would really appreciate it. In return, if you go to my website, mariette'sonthemove.com, and register for the Monday mailer, I'll send you a free Fred workbook to get your journey started. This is also where you can find all the show notes and all the ways to get in touch with me. A special thanks goes out to Rogue Media for its wisdom and partnership. Until next time, friends, keep moving forward towards your dreams. Oh, and the legal stuff. This podcast is presented solely for educational and entertainment purposes. I am a certified coach, not a licensed therapist, and this is not meant to replace the professional advice of a physician, psychotherapist, or other qualified professionals. This is solely my perspective based on my own experience and training. Okay, now it's over. For reals. Bye for now.
This has been a Rogue Media Network production.